the scene. He's got the voice that's mean, asking those questions that you never seen. He's got that fire, burning bright and clean. Andrew Keen making waves, break the routine on the Keen on show. He brings the heat, asking the minds, digging deep till they bleed. No sugar-coated truths, no lies to deceive. Andrew Keen, the master of the interview beat. He's got the knowledge, he's got the flair, challenging ideas with a fearless stare. With every question, he's uncovering what's there. Andrew Keen, a truth seeker, he's aware.
Hello, everybody. 3 years ago now, we did a great show with a British therapist, psychiatrist actually, Lucy Jones, on the relationship between the natural world and the human psyche. She had a book out back then, Losing Eden, a fundamental need for the natural world and its ability to heal body and soul. A conversation with Jones focused on the dual crises, the crisis of the environment and the crisis of our mental health, which some people describe as our age of anxiety. We are back with the same subject today, a similar perhaps narrative, certainly an autobiography, with my guest Banning Lyon, who has a new memoir out, The Chair and the Valley, a memoir of trauma, healing, and the outdoors. Banning is joining us from Martinez in California, just over the bay from where I am. Banning, congratulations on the new book. Before we get to your story, is it coincidental that we seem to live in this world of dual crises, the crisis of the destruction of the natural world and the crisis of our own psyches?
No, I don't think there's any coincidence at all. I mean, I think that, I'm a backpacking guide and outdoor instructor. And one thing that I frequently share with my clients is that, for example, there are lots of studies that come out now that show that, for example, the outdoors is good for our mental health. But I think what those studies are showing isn't that the outdoors is good for our mental health. It's that our lives, our current lives, are bad for our mental health. I frequently tell my clients and students that the outdoors is where we came from. It's our home. Our home is not these framed houses where we live. And so when we're living in a world that's constantly under threat, both through climate change and policies and other things, then I think our connection to that, the sort of existential fear that a lot of people are having, especially the younger generations, over the future of our planet, I don't think there's any coincidence in that at all. No.
Then more and more every day, it seems new studies come out suggesting we live in the age of trauma, particularly of young people. A nation in stress is what people describe. Therapists, researchers describe the current state of young Americans. But your story doesn't start in 2023 or 2024, or certainly even in the time of COVID. It begins when you were 15 in about 1987. So before we actually get to your story, do you think that this current age of trauma, of crisis, particularly of young people, has it been brewing for a long time? And now it's all everyone seems to be talking about. But did it exist in the 80s and the 70s? I don't want to trivialize your own narrative and suggest that your stuff only makes sense if everyone else was experiencing it. But I'm also curious as to how you historicize your own condition.
I think I don't personally find a huge connection between what I experienced and the sort of, to use the term again, the sort of existential crisis that a lot of the younger generations are suffering from now. In 1987, when I was 15 and I was put in the hospital, social media didn't even exist. I think a lot of the stressors that existed at the time were far smaller and weren't nearly as powerful as what a lot of adolescents are suffering from today. I think the stressors on kids nowadays are significantly higher. I mean, how many of us who are in our 30s or 40s or 50s say nowadays, like, I would never want to grow up with social media, or would never want to grow up today? Like, the difficulty of it would just be too much to navigate. And so I really I deeply sympathize with a lot of adolescents that are going through a lot of the things that they're challenged with nowadays. I think the things that I suffered from were relatively unique to me, although I think a lot of people can relate to them in sort of a broader sense. Um, but I don't think a lot of what adolescents are feeling or stressed by nowadays are things that I really had to deal with at all.
Banning, your story has a nightmarish quality. It actually came out, I think many people first heard about it in a piece you wrote in the New York Times back in 1993, You're Sane Now. It began in 1987, but perhaps before we even get to 87, tell us a little bit about who you are and where you were born.
So I was born in Southern California in a very affluent suburb. I really was kind of the kid who had it all. My dad was a pilot. We were very well off. My mom was a travel agent, and I sort of lived. I, had an older sister, and we were just this nuclear family, and really kind of had everything going for us. Um, I was young enough before my parents divorced that I wasn't really aware of a lot of the stress in their relationship, and they were separated and then ultimately divorced when I was 11 years old. So a lot of that stuff I was kind of out of the loop. But when that divorce took place, my life just completely disintegrated, and they continued to disintegrate after that because of the circumstances around, like, each chapter of where things continue to go wrong.
Is there a Southern California quality, maybe quality isn't the right word, to what you experienced, or could you have been born equally on the East Coast, the Midwest, the South, and still had the same experience?
That's an interesting question. I've never thought of that. I do think, I won't speak to the circumstances around my parents' divorce, honestly, because a lot of it's opaque to me. I still, to this day, don't fully understand what triggered it. I know some things, but not much. But I do think that there were potentially some things about the sort of Southern California lifestyle that may have contributed to not only my parents' divorce, but the way that it happened. There was a lot of talk about divorce at the time in the early 80s. When it happened, and you may recall this, but there was a film at the time that was relatively new called Kramer versus Kramer.
Mm.
And I remember seeing little bits of that film on HBO when I was a little boy, and it actually really frightened me because I thought divorce was this new invention, and I thought that I had been sort of caught up in this thing that was culturally sort of in the zeitgeist at the time. Little did I know that it it existed for a long time, and it wasn't specific to me. But yeah, I mean, I think there is a potential, like a possibility that maybe some part of what I experienced was due to just my location and the demographic I was born into. Potentially, yeah, maybe it's interesting.
The book, your new book, The Chair in the Valley, is a memoir, but I'd say there's a fictional quality, but fiction writers might read this and think, well, I could have made this up. The 80s, Southern California, Reagan, prosperity,
Yeah.
and this bizarre, nightmarish narrative of and you're gonna. I'm not sure how much you want to get into your story in this
Mhm.
conversation because, of course, we want everyone to read the book. But is there a political dimension to all this? Can we blame it all on? We seem to be blaming everything these days on the Republicans and neoliberalism and Trump or Reagan. Has that ever occurred to you that that there is a political accompaniment to your narrative, your memoir?
Um, it did not occur to me at the time, when I was going through this experience of being locked in this psychiatric hospital Granted, I was 15. I was mostly ignorant of that portion of life. And it wasn't until I got swept up in a lawsuit several years after I left the hospital, involving the circumstances around my hospitalization, that I wound up kind of
Yeah, and
learning.
this was a class action suit against National Medical Enterprises known as
Correct.
Tenet Healthcare.
Yeah. And when I got wrapped up in that, I began to learn more about um, the regulations and oversight, or lack thereof, around um, inpatient psychiatry, and the rights regarding psychiatric patients. And that is when it began to sort of take on maybe a little bit of a more political tone. And then several years after the lawsuit, I was invited to speak in front of Congress along with my attorney, and another guy I was in the hospital with. I declined. I did not go for several reasons, but my attorney and my friend from the hospital did go, um, those transcripts are still available. And it was clear by that time that the government had failed in some ways, protecting like inpatient treatment and the patients who can't care for themselves in facilities. And I think those circumstances still exist to this day.
Yeah, reading your story, the issue of a radically privatized healthcare system does raise a number of warnings. We always joke on my show about, well, this wouldn't have happened in Denmark or New Zealand. I'm not sure how familiar you are with the Danish or the New Zealand or even the Canadian healthcare system. But had you had a national healthcare system a la New Zealand or Canada, do you think, again, there might not have been a book, The Chair in the Valley, and this whole nightmarish experience that you've had?
I think it would have vastly reduced the likelihood of something like this happening. The circumstances around how my hospital was managed, those circumstances were governed almost primarily from the fact that it was a privately owned institution. And let's be honest, we live in a country where all medicine, regardless of whether it's mental, emotional, physical, is driven by profit. We live in a profit-driven medical care system, and whenever you create a system where hospitals and physicians are driven by profit, there is going to be corruption. There's corruption wherever humans exist. That's just the nature of humanity. But I think if I had lived in a country with nationalized medical care, I think it very likely would have reduced the likelihood of anything like this happening, for sure.
We're speaking with Banning Lyon, the author of an important new memoir, The Chair and the Valley, a memoir of trauma, healing, and the outdoors. First half of the show, we've talked about everything. We've talked around his story. We haven't even got into the details. We're going to do that in the second half. But I want to remind everyone that great guests like Banning are brought to us because of our friends at Liberties, excellent new quarterly publication of culture and politics. Going to run short feature on Liberties, and then we'll be back with Banning Lyon to talk about the details of his new memoir and his life. So don't go away, anyone.
The noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
We are back with Banning Lyon, the author of The Chair and the Valley. Banning, in the first half of the show, we talked about everything except the story. I hope we still have our audience, and I hope people are intrigued. I'm not sure how much you want to give away. Perhaps you might not give everything away, because we do want people to read the new book. But let's begin. What happened in 1987 to trigger this nightmarish story that you experienced?
So a lot of this is, I've told my story so many times, so it can involve a lot of time and detail. So I'm going to try to give you just the very, like the broad strokes here. So in 1987, several years after my parents' divorce, I had been shipped around, kind of in a pawn in a custody battle, in my parents' custody battle. I wound up being sent to Texas to live with my extended relatives, and I had fallen really deeply in love with punk rock and skateboarding and all the culture involved in it.
How
And
old
then
were you? Were 15, right?
I was 15, yeah. And at the time, Texas still, is still a very conservative state, but at the time it was even more conservative. And so having spiked hair and being into punk rock and I'd spray paint my clothing and I was an oddball. I mean, I kind of stuck out and so I wound up my good friend at the time broke his skateboard. And so as a gesture of both altruism and kind of selfishness, because there was another skateboard I wanted to buy, I gave him mine because I wanted to go skating with my friend. So I used this as an excuse to buy this new board. So my school counselor got wind of this, called my mom, and told my mom that my gesture was a sign that I was suicidal, and because I was giving away my most prized personal possession. So through a game of telephone, through kids at school and everything else, this wound up being blown way out of proportion, and through a lot of ignorance of the adults around me and people just simply not listening to me, and not I would explain to them, like, look up on this new board, I'm not suicidal, but nobody listened to me. They just thought I was I don't, they just thought I was a stupid 15-year-old. And
Did you
so,
have any history of
no,
mental illness?
no, not at all. In fact, at the time, my life was rough at the time, but it was kind of for the first time sort of looking up. Like I felt like I was kind of barely beginning to grow roots in this new state, and I'd kind of made some friends, and for the first time my life was kind of becoming just a little stable, and I was things were sort of looking up. That's kind of how I felt at the time. So long story short, they wound my parents, together, um, even though they were divorced, wound up agreeing to have me signed into this psychiatric hospital at the recommendation of this therapist.
What was your relationship with your parents at the time?
Well, my dad was totally out of the picture. I hadn't spoken to my dad in probably a year and a half or 2 years at the time. We were not close. He had no understanding of me as a person. My mom was a workaholic, and she had a breakdown after my parents' divorce. So she was really no family knew me well. The people who knew me the best
Yeah,
were
and I mean, so
my
that's
friends.
rather unusual. I mean, for a 15-year-old not to talk to their father for a couple of years and for your
Yeah.
mother. So this was an unusual family.
Well, yeah, and
That's,
I think that contributed to
I
the
mean, I don't know whether you would
circumstances.
call it a family, it was something else.
Yeah, it wasn't really a family. I think that's an accurate description.
Did you
And
have
so
brothers and sisters?
I do have an older sister. Well, and I have other extended family now, but that's complicated. But at the time, I had an older sister, and but her and I weren't close. She still lived in California. I hadn't seen her by that time for at least 2 years. Hadn't spoken to her in 2 years. So I was pretty isolated from my family. And that I think contributed to a lot of the ignorance and my parents just throwing their hands up and saying, we're just going to trust these psychiatrists.
Did you think that was odd, or the people you were talking to and you were associated with in Texas, didn't they think it was a bit odd? You hadn't spoken to your sister, you hadn't talked to your father for
Honestly,
years.
I'm not sure even many of the adults in my life at the time, like my school counselor, anybody really knew that, because nobody's took time to get to know me. I
Mm.
was just this kid, and I was the cog in the machine, and I don't, other than my friends, my contemporaries, kids my age, very few people, adults, knew anything about me because they didn't take the time to do it. So,
So yeah, so I keep on interrupting. I apologize. So go on with the story.
so I was signed into this institution for a quote unquote 2-week evaluation. And I won't, that portion of the story alone can take a long time to explain. I wound up being there for 353 days. I didn't go outside for I think the longest I didn't go outside was for about 5 months. Um, a significant part of my quote unquote therapy was what the doctors called chair therapy, which is where I had to sit in a chair facing the wall for, you know, on a good day, 6 hours, on a bad day, 12 hours. I would just sit and face the wall. Um, and that was, I did that for months and months and months. I did that for, I think I was on, it started on what was called indefinite chair, and then I was put on permanent chair, and then I was put on permanent chair and room. And then ultimately I was just sitting chair in my room the whole time.
And was that a punishment, or was it something that the doctors thought would cure you of whatever they thought you had?
I don't know. The initial reason I was put on chair, what we called chair in the hospital, was because I kept forgetting to close the door to my room. So initially it was punitive. I mean, it was a punishment. They're like, the rule here is you close your door. You don't close your door, you get what's called a 30-minute chair. I'd gotten so many 30-minute chairs and forgot to close my door so many times that they finally put me on a definite chair. And then when you're on a definite chair, they can't give you a 30-minute chair because you're already on chair. So they would give you what's called a test mark. And I got so many test marks that they wound up increasing the severity of my chair restriction. And so I wound up ultimately on what was called permanent chair in room without meals, which means I had to eat meals in my room, like with my food on a tray. And I was isolated all day long. It's like being in solitary confinement.
Yeah, it sounds like the end of a nightmarish story, but it's actually the beginning. You wrote a piece last year for the Washington Post entitled, "When I was 15, a psychiatric hospital nearly ruined my life. This advice saved me." So what did save you, Banning? How did you get out of this? How did you get out the chair, off the chair?
Well, really early on in my stay, I was talking with a friend of mine from the hospital the other day, that within a month of being on what was called the adolescent long-term unit, I realized that the only people who ever seemed to leave always said the same thing, which is my insurance is pulling me. And that meant their insurance was cutting off funding and that they were going to leave. And for a lot of kids, those kids have been there, some of them for 2 to 3, almost even 4 years, almost their entire, like from age 13 to 17, if you can imagine that. And so that
I
was
can't. I mean,
yeah, that was
and this is all
nightmarish to me.
completely legal.
Correct. There were no regulations at the time preventing any of this because the psychiatrists had carte blanche to be able to quote unquote care for their patients. And so um, I I wound up, like I said, being there 353 days. I sat chair, and then ultimately my insurance ran out, and my father's insurance company cut funding, and I was sent to a residential treatment program, what's called a halfway house, and I was in the halfway house for 6 months to sort of reintroduce me into the real world.
And
Which
then you were there almost a year. Did your parents come out? I mean, you said you weren't talking to your father. Your mother was a workaholic, but did they come out and try to address this crisis?
Well, so I saw my dad twice. I saw my dad once when my appendix ruptured and I was sent to the medical portion of the hospital for several days after my surgery. My dad came to visit, and then he came to visit me once shortly, right around my birthday. Those are the only 2 times I saw my father while I was there. My mom I saw nearly every week, and she witnessed a lot of the conditions in the hospital. In the hospital, it's very hard for me to explain the hospital to people because it's not a world that many, even people who've been in like current inpatient psychiatric units, can really understand, because there were several people, for example, on my unit, kids that had been strapped to beds with what were called leather posy restraints for weeks and months. One girl had even been strapped to her bed for 18 months. A good friend of mine, the one who's spoken in front of Congress, was strapped to his bed for 333 days. He needed physical rehab to walk again. This was therapy. This was quote unquote therapy. And so my mom would see this treatment, but every visit with my mom was supervised. So if I started during a visit saying, I want to leave, they would cut the visit short. And so we were never allowed to discuss the conditions of the hospital with our parents or to implore them, like,
So
please, please.
it sounds as if it wasn't unlike jail.
I mean, as far as I'm concerned, where we were in some ways, you know, I've never really been in jail, so I can't really compare the two. But from my understanding, most prisoners have X number of minutes or hours that they have to spend outside every day, that they're given access to the outdoors. We didn't even have that. Like we did not have any access to the outdoors. We wouldn't go outside for months at a time.
Was there any physical punishment, sexual punishment? I mean, was this going on in the hospital too?
I never personally experienced. I mean, yes, I sat in a chair. I was forced to sit in a chair and face a wall. So absolutely, there was physical punishment, and some kids were strapped to beds. Um, Sexual abuse, I have no idea if any took place on our unit. I never heard of any, but I don't know of that.
Whereabouts in Texas was this?
The hospital where I was located was in Dallas.
And were there nurses, doctors who recognized perhaps the criminality of this, or certainly the injustice of it?
You know, I don't. This is something of all the things that sort of haunt me from the hospital is what was the motivation? Like how all these staff members and nurses and doctors who operated this place and came to work, what were they? Did they really truly believe that this was helping us? Like, did how do you make somebody sit in a chair for hours and hours and hours a day, give them no access to the outdoors, and yet tell them that they suffer from depression, that this is supposed to help them? I have no answer to this. I don't know if people were just falling into line because they're like, hey, the professionals know what they're doing, and they wouldn't be doing this if it weren't for the kids or good for the kids. I have no idea what was motivating these people. None.
Well, fortunately for everyone, particularly you, of course, Banning, the title of your new book is not just The Chair, and it's not just a memoir of trauma. It's also about healing. The book is called The Chair and the Valley, a memoir of trauma, healing, and the outdoors. So when does the valley appear in your narrative?
So I had grown up outdoors, spending a lot of time with my dad when I was young, and the outdoors has kind of always become my safe place. And I think in many ways that was one of the things that made the hospital so traumatizing for me, is I had no access to it. And so when I left the hospital, I was a wreck. I realized pretty quickly that I couldn't relate to people in the outside world anymore. I just didn't feel right. And it wasn't until I was much older that I understood, like teenagers, their prefrontal cortex is rewiring itself in whatever circumstances they're living in it as a teenager, become really deeply wired into their psyche. And so that was me. I had spent this year in this nightmarish institution. And so that got hardwired into me. And so the only solace I found in ever really was being outside. And for me, for a long time, it was skateboarding. And so I continued skating when I was in the halfway house and afterward. And then many years passed, and I just continued to try to make sense of what had happened to me. The hospital was this experience that was like this Gordian knot. Like I kept working this thing, trying to figure out, like, why was I there? Even after the lawsuit, even continuing for years, I kept wanting to try to understand my place in the world and the effect that this place had had on me. And so after ultimately going through what amounted to 2 suicide attempts, I made a decision to absolutely change my life. I was like, I've got to do something to fix me. And I returned to the outdoors. And so I became a backpacking guide in Yosemite National Park. And I had assumed in getting that job that I would just get to be outside a lot, and that I would be able to sort of validate my existence through the eyes of other people. Other people would see me as capable and strong, and that I would get to be outside. And I walked into that job thinking that that was what the job was about. But lo and behold, the woman who hired me, who was my boss, I learned from her very quickly that our clients often came to Yosemite for reasons often that they didn't understand. We would have clients show up because they were celebrating 10 years free of cancer, or they came to scatter the ashes of their wife or daughter or child or husband. We had one gentleman show up who he booked a 4-day trip just because he wanted to cross a creek, because his brother had drowned crossing a creek and he wanted to cross one for his brother. And I had no idea that that's what this job was going to be about. And so throughout that first season, I wound up spending nearly 2.5 months straight in the park. Like, I just worked all the time. I wound up learning through my clients that I feel I have always felt broken in a very unique way, that I'm this unique puzzle piece that's been damaged and nobody will ever understand me. And through my clients and learning about their stories, and then ultimately sharing my story with them, I wound up discovering that we all feel this way. Like, it's not unique to me. It's not unique to a couple other people. It's unique. It's a lot, hundreds and hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people understand what it's like to feel uniquely broken, and that nobody will ever understand you. And it isn't until we share our stories with each other that we'll realize, oh, we aren't that different. We have a lot of common threads among us. But because there is this enormous stigma around mental health in our country, we simply don't share our wounds with each other. And that isolation feeds on itself. It's like Ouroboros. It's like this snake eating its own tail, and it becomes this negative feedback loop where we grow increasingly afraid of this wound that haunts us that we can't seem to solve. Yet just speaking about it with other people and realizing that other people feel the same way is the cure. That is what will help us overcome that. And it won't be until we come up with a healthy attitude around mental health and start to break down that stigma, will people be able to feel more comfortable sharing their stories. And that was the prime motivator of me writing this book, because I wanted people to understand that our wounds don't need to define us. We are not the trauma that happened to us. We are not that one wound that we just can't understand. Other people feel that way too. And when you share that with them, we'll start to build that sort of common ground.
And meanwhile, in the midst of all this, you went public with what you experienced. You wrote the New York Times piece in 1993, and you were involved in a class action lawsuit against the medical establishment, so-called medical establishment. I know also your own sort of personal relationships and sense of family changed dramatically in the 6 or 7 years after leaving this, after experiencing the chair. What happened? And did you discover a new family, a new self? Was it all bound up together?
Yes, it was. I mean, it began ultimately with me having essentially lost my family. You know, my dad had been out of my life and never really reached out to me. And my mom and our relationship continued to disintegrate. And she ultimately just kind of abandoned me. And in that sort of gaping hole that was left behind, I learned to just sort of be alone. You know, I've been emotionally, I spent most of my life being emotionally alone from the age of 11, really. And I really wanted to learn to just be independent. I thought I would spend most of my life trying to master the ability to just be alone. And I've spent a lot of my life doing it. And what I ultimately learned is that, and I will admit this, like right now, that I feel shame in admitting that I I need people. Like, we are primates. Like, human beings are primates. We live socially active lives, and without that, we something is missing. It's no mystery. There's all sorts of studies that show that people who are close to their families live longer. And so I ultimately, through my life and becoming a guide and um, just through circumstance, wound up finding people who believed in me, who gave me a chance, and who saw something in me that I didn't. And I opened my heart to some of those people, and they kind of became family to me, where I had an absence of a family. And so through trust and love and friendship, I created lots of other families in my life. And so, I don't want to ruin too much, because some of
Yeah,
this
we
is
won't
really
ruin
poured
everything.
in the book. But
I won't.
yeah,
People need to read the book.
family of choice is a crucial component of my life, and I have lots of families that mean a lot to me, um, that I never expected to have.
And
And
in a sense, Banning, the chair is the anti-family. It's solitary confinement. Is the valley, in your experience of the outdoors, is that community? And in a sense, when you're in the valley, when you're outdoors, when you're living the outdoor life, is that connectivity, even if there aren't other people around, is that the great antidote to the anxiety, to the experiences you've had, and in that sense, very much in keeping with what Lucy Jones argues in Losing Eden?
I love that. I love that you said that. That's such a lovely observation, that the chair is sort of the anti-family, and the valley is that community. And I think that's so true, because um, being outdoors, and I mean, I could spend hours talking about the outdoors, but one of the most incredible things about the outdoors for me is that it's entirely indifferent to our existence. Whether you're
Mm.
going sailing and you're on the ocean, or whether you're hiking through the woods, or um, you're just walking in a public park, like birds, deer, wildlife, plants. Nature is indifferent to us. It does not care about our well-being or anything else. And there is something about that that is really freeing. Nature can make us feel really small, and not small in the sense that we're unimportant, but small in the sense that we're part of something bigger and more beautiful than us. And I think that that's something that human beings tend to struggle with, is that, oh, if we're small and something's indifferent to us, then it's not acknowledging our existence, and that makes us less important. But to me, that sense of feeling small makes me feel like I'm part of something bigger and more beautiful. And that to me is a lot of what the joy of being outdoors is about. I mean, I could get into all the things about like white noise and sunlight and all the benefits of fresh air. All that stuff there's loads of studies that can prove that stuff better than I can express it. But I think that sense of feeling like you're a part of a bigger, more beautiful universe, for me, is something that I can't explain. I haven't seen anybody really be able to explain it from a scientific standpoint, but it's just good for us. And when you get to share that with other people, that's, I think, one reason I love being a backpacking guide, is I get to see people see Yosemite for the first time. And every time I get to see a client see Yosemite for the first time, it's like I get to see it for the first time again. So I've gotten to see Yosemite for the first time hundreds of times, and that joy never gets old to me, ever.
Yeah, you should have a look at Lucy Jones's book. I think it will really resonate. Finally, Banning, your book was published by Maria Shriver in her new press, and you wrote something for her new publication about 5 tips to help kids who are struggling, the kind of kids who are going through now what you went through in the 80s. I don't want to get into all the details, but perhaps we might end on a positive note for people watching this with kids who are struggling, or kids themselves. What would you say? What have you learned? What does your story tell us about getting from the chair to the valley?
I'm a dad now. My daughter's 3. She's very young. I don't have a teenager yet, although she thinks she's a teenager, I think. I One of the things that I have always believed, even when I was a teenager, and I still believe it to this day, is that adults sort of lose sight of what it's like to be a kid. And we somehow look back on childhood or being a teenager as a phase. And I think that's incredibly unfair to teenagers. The
Mm,
30s are a phase, the 40s are a phase, the 50s are a phase. Each of our lives, a portion of our lives is a phase. And that doesn't mean that being a teenager is any less important. It doesn't mean that the problems that are unique to teenagers are just going to go away magically when they turn 20. And I think a lot of adults need to stop treating teenagers like their problems are just fleeting or less important. And they're human beings just like us, and their problems are super complex and they feel really big to them. And of all things, like I mentioned earlier, their brains are rewiring themselves. So if you want to do your kid a favor, the best thing you can do is just sit down and listen to them. Treat them like a human being, respect their feelings. When they tell you something, take it for face value. Don't try to second guess it or reinterpret it. When they share things with you, whether it's music or culture, even if you don't like it, try to build a bridge with that. They're reaching out to you. Um, I think a lot of kids nowadays are struggling. Study after study after study shows that the sense of despair that kids are feeling nowadays is just increasing and increasing and increasing. And I think a lot of that is because of this disconnect, and you can assign it to social media, which I think is accurate. But I think there's lots of contributors. I'm not going to use Occam's razor because I don't think it's that simple to just assign one single solution or one single problem that's causing this. I think there's a lot of them. And I think one of those things, one of the most important, are the relationships that kids have with their parents. I think parents need to treat their kids with more respect, and their feelings and emotions and the things that they love with more respect.
Can I step on the scene? I'm ready to attack. Andrew Keane. Yeah, he's the one to bash. Asking questions, no filter, just keeps on grinning. He's the man who's got the whole crowd spinning. Money, fame, success, it's all in his sight. He'll dig deep, expose you with all his might. No sugarcoating, he'll cut right through. Andrew King, he's the one to spew. Yeah, he's an expert.